13,000 years ago, ice still ruled. Mammoths roamed, coastlines stretched far beyond today's seas, and small groups of humans clung to survival at the edge of a thawing world. Then, without warning, everything changed. The climate lurched into chaos. Temperatures plummeted, glaciers surged, storms ripped through entire regions, and oceans began to rise. Rivers overflowed their banks, coastlines disappeared, and floods swallowed landscapes where people once hunted and lived. It was as if the world itself had turned against its inhabitants. This sudden 1,000-year disruption has a name, the Younger Dryas, but that phrase hardly captures the scale of devastation. For the people who lived through it, it would have felt like the end of the world. And here's where it gets fascinating. Across nearly every corner of the globe, cultures preserve stories of a great flood. In Mesopotamia, in India, among the Hopi of North America, in the legends of Aboriginal Australians, and in dozens of Pacific Island traditions, we find tales of a deluge so vast it nearly wiped humanity out. Survivors cling to boats, mountaintops, or hidden refuges. Whole worlds drown. Could these stories be more than myth? Could they be fragments of memory passed down across thousands of years, encoding the trauma of the Younger Dryas into the fabric of human storytelling? Think about it. Back then, there was no writing. Knowledge moved by word of mouth, generation after generation. Over centuries, facts and memory blurred with symbolism, but the core remained. The world drowned. Civilizations fell. A new one had to rise from the ruins. And perhaps most haunting of all, what was lost. If humanity already lived along coasts, rivers, and fertile plains that are now buried beneath the ocean, then entire chapters of our story may be missing. Cities swallowed, knowledge forgotten, monuments ground away by time and tide. Today, divers and archaeologists are only beginning to find traces of these hidden worlds. Submerged structures deep in inland seas, mysterious ruins beneath the Mediterranean, and vast landscapes that once connected Britain to Europe, just to name a few. What if the Great Flood wasn't a single event, but the global echo of the Younger Dryas? A catastrophe written not in books, but into the memories of survivors who rebuilt from the mud and ice. And here's the question that pulls us forward. If the world drowned once before, what did it take with it? And what clues did it leave behind for us to uncover? "13,000 years ago, Earth was thawing. Glaciers that had smothered continents for tens of thousands of years were finally in retreat. Great lakes, formed by walls of ice, stretched across North America. Vast rivers, swollen with water, poured into the oceans. To the people alive then, hunter-gatherers scattered across the continents, the world must have seemed on the brink of renewal. Forests were expanding, game was plentiful. The Ice Age was ending, and a new era of abundance seemed just within reach. And then, almost without warning, everything changed. The climate snapped back into an icy grip. Temperatures dropped up to 15 degrees Celsius in the northern hemisphere, reversing centuries of warming. Glaciers that had been retreating began to surge forward again. Seasons collapsed into chaos, long, bitter winters and short, stunted summers. Rivers froze, then flooded. Plains that had seemed fertile were suddenly locked in frost. This was the Younger Dryas, a 1,000-year cold snap that interrupted the end of the Ice Age and reshaped the course of human history. The shock was its speed. Climate usually drifts over millennia, but this shift came within decades, fast enough to devastate entire lifetimes. A parent could have lived in a warming world, while their children came of age in an unforgiving, frozen one. What could cause such a sudden reversal? One mainstream explanation is water, too much of it, too quickly. As the great ice sheets melted, they fed enormous lakes across North America. At some point, the ice dams holding them back gave way. Torrents of meltwater surged north into the Arctic Ocean, overwhelming the Atlantic circulation that normally carried warm currents from the tropics. With that system disrupted, Europe and much of the North plunged into deep freeze, but not everyone agrees water alone explains it. Another theory suggests fire from above, a cosmic impact. Around 12,800 years ago, a swarm of comets or fragments of a larger body may have struck the Earth, igniting wildfires, blasting debris into the sky, and triggering the sudden cooling. This comet hypothesis, championed by researchers like Richard Firestone, Alan West, and more recently by authors like Graham Hancock, is still debated. Critics argue the evidence is patchy. Supporters point to a strange black layer found across sites in North America and beyond, filled with nanodiamonds, melted minerals, and charcoal, all signs, they say, of something catastrophic. So, was the Younger Dryas a story of water or fire, ice breaking or sky falling? The truth may be tangled, but what we do know is this: whatever the cause, the effects were apocalyptic. Picture Earth at the time. In North America, glacial lakes like Agassiz and Missoula sprawled for hundreds of miles. These were not calm, placid waters. They were ticking time bombs, hemmed in by fragile walls of ice. When those dams failed, the floods unleashed were almost beyond imagination. Walls of water tore across the land, scouring the earth to bedrock. They carved vast canyons, hurled boulders the size of houses, and left scars still visible today. The famous scablands of Washington state are the remnants of these cataclysms, dry riverbeds so vast they look carved for giants. If you had stood on those plains, you might have seen a wave taller than a skyscraper racing toward you, faster than any person could run. It would have been a roar, a thunder, a living wall of water and debris swallowing everything in its path. And it wasn't just one flood. These outbursts may have happened again and again, each one reshaping the land anew. Valleys became seas, and rivers were torn from their courses. Elsewhere, the seas themselves were rising. Over the course of the Ice Age's end, global sea levels climbed more than 120 meters. Entire coastlines vanished beneath the waves. Fertile river deltas drowned. Islands were swallowed whole. And while this rise happened over centuries, evidence hints at sudden surges, catastrophic jumps that would have been noticed within a single lifetime. Imagine living in a village near the coast, watching the ocean creep higher each year, only to have a single storm surge erase the land entirely. How many early human settlements now lie beneath 100 meters of water, their traces erased by tides? Could this explain the myths of sunken cities that echo across so many cultures? Atlantis in Greece, Wise in France, Dwarka in India. Are these just legends or memories of real places swallowed by post-Ice Age seas? As if water and ice weren't enough, fire joined the assault. Across North America and beyond, a strange black mat layer appears in the sediment, dating to the start of the Younger Dryas. It is thick with soot, charcoal, and signs of massive burning. Entire continents may have been choked by firestorms, whether sparked by comet fragments or by the chain reaction of environmental chaos. The skies would have been darkened with smoke and dust. For those alive, the sun may have been dimmed to a red ember, the stars blotted out for weeks. The world would have smelled of ash and decay. This sudden burning coincides with one of Earth's great extinctions: mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, all gone within a geological blink. For millennia, humans had lived alongside these creatures, hunted them, depended on them, and then, within centuries, they were gone. Was it human hunting that pushed them over the edge, or the collapsing ecosystems of the Younger Dryas? Perhaps both. But the disappearance of these animals was more than a loss of food. It was the tearing away of the familiar, the end of an age of giants. To live through this period was to exist in constant uncertainty. One season might bring floods, the next fire, the next bitter cold. Landscapes could change within a single lifetime. Hunting grounds disappeared as animals migrated or died. Forests shifted, grasslands withered, and fertile valleys drowned. People would have been forced to move, to adapt, to survive against odds that must have felt insurmountable. And in such times, what stories would they tell? how would they explain the world unraveling around them? Perhaps they spoke of gods unleashing punishment, or of battles in the heavens. Perhaps they passed down the memory of floods so great they erased whole peoples, preserving those memories until they emerged as myths thousands of years later. One of the most tantalizing mysteries tied to this upheaval lies offshore. We know that coastlines shifted dramatically. The continental shelves that are now under shallow seas were once dry land. If early humans clustered near the water, as people so often do, then many of their homes, villages, perhaps even cities, may now lie hidden beneath the waves. Consider Doggerland, once a rich plain connecting Britain to mainland Europe, now beneath the North Sea, or the submerged structures off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, which some argue are remnants of human construction. In India's Gulf of Khambat, sonar surveys have hinted at ancient ruins beneath the mud, though debate continues. If a thriving culture existed along those lost coasts, the Younger Dryas floods could have obliterated them, leaving behind only the faintest traces and the stories told by survivors. There's also the unsettling possibility that something fell from above. Advocates of the comet hypothesis argue that fragments of a disintegrating comet struck the ice sheets of North America, unleashing both fire and flood. The evidence they cite, nanodiamonds, shocked quartz, melt glass droplets, may be the fingerprints of such an impact. If true, then those who survived might have looked to the sky in terror, a blazing streak across the heavens, followed by a rain of fire. To ancient eyes, this could only have been the wrath of gods or spirits. And when we read myths of fiery serpents falling from the heavens, or of stars cast down to earth, are we glimpsing their memories encoded in symbolic language? Nearly every culture on earth carries some version of a flood story. In Mesopotamia, the gods send a deluge to wipe out humanity, sparing only Utnapishtim, who survives in a great boat. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah builds an ark to ride out the waters that cover the earth. The Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived a flood sent by Zeus. The Hopi of North America recall a time when water rose to cover the land. Aboriginal Australians speak of seas that swallowed their coasts. Are these coincidences, separate inventions born of imagination, or are they echoes of real events handed down across generations? If the Younger Dryas was indeed the Great Flood remembered in myth, then perhaps those stories are not allegory, but memory, fragile threads connecting us to a time when the world itself nearly drowned. So what was the Younger Dryas? A natural hiccup in Earth's climate system? A catastrophe triggered by ice, water, and shifting currents? Or the scar left by something far more sudden falling from the sky? Whatever the cause, its effects were world-shaping. It was 1,000 years of chaos, a crucible through which humanity passed, forever changed. And as we'll see next, while the earth itself was in upheaval, so too were the lives of the people trying to survive within it. Were they merely scattered tribes clinging to survival, or were there cultures, perhaps even civilizations, that the floodwaters erased? When archaeologists dig into the Earth's layers from around 12,800 years ago, the period marking the Younger Dryas, something unusual shows up. Traditions vanish. Distinct tool styles fade. Populations that once thrived seem to fall silent in the record. It's as though human history was interrupted. This is where the real human cost of the Younger Dryas comes into focus, not in abstract charts or ice cores, but in the sudden absence of the people who once built, hunted, and lived in these landscapes. In North America, the Clovis culture provides the clearest case. The Clovis people, once thought to be America's first culture, crafted fluted spear points perfectly suited for hunting mammoths and other Ice Age giants. Yet around the onset of the Younger Dryas, their presence almost completely disappears. Archaeologists debate the cause. One explanation points to the collapse of megafauna populations. With the mammoths and giant bison gone, Clovis hunting practices became unsustainable. Another points to environmental upheaval, landscapes transformed by floods, fires, and climate shock. A more controversial theory, the comet impact hypothesis, suggests something even more dramatic. Debris raining down from the sky, triggering continent-wide fires and scattering a thin layer of carbon and microscopic diamonds across the soil. Whatever the reason, the Clovis left behind one of archaeology's sharpest breaks, evidence of a culture that thrived, then vanished. Across the ocean in the Levant, the Natufians were taking humanity in a different direction. Unlike the nomadic hunters of North America, they were experimenting with permanent villages, harvesting wild cereals, and even laying the groundwork for farming. Some of the earliest stone houses, round structures with central hearths, come from Natufian sites. Their communities had cemeteries, ornaments, and evidence of social organization. They were poised to make the great leap into agriculture. Then the Younger Dryas hit. Crops withered in the dry cold, settlements broke apart, and people returned to nomadism. Farming would not fully recover until the climate stabilized centuries later. Imagine being on the cusp of rewriting human life with agriculture, only to have nature itself erase your progress. If the Natufians show us what was lost, Gobekli Tepe in modern Turkey shows us what might have emerged from the ashes. Built right at the end of the Younger Dryas, around 11,600 years ago, this site stunned archaeologists. Massive stone pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, were carved with animals and abstract symbols, then arranged in great stone circles. The builders were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, yet here they were moving megaliths and organizing large communal labor. There is no obvious precursor. Gobekli Tepe seems to appear almost out of nowhere. Was it a sudden leap in social complexity? Or was it, as some suggest, the continuation of ideas passed down from a culture that had existed before the catastrophe, preserving fragments of their world in stone? Elsewhere, other sites tell us that humanity was not as primitive as often assumed. Jericho in the Jordan Valley shows signs of occupation stretching back before and during the Younger Dryas. Its earliest settlement included stone walls and a striking 28-foot tower, evidence of construction on a scale unexpected for its time. Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, though slightly later, suggests how these early impulses toward complex living were sustained after the climatic recovery. Houses were packed closely together, wall paintings adorned interiors, and communities displayed evidence of ritual practices. Were these developments simply delayed by the Younger Dryas, or were they reactions to trauma, a rebuilding of society after destruction? Further afield, the evidence becomes more elusive but just as tantalizing. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, divers have reported submerged structures that some argue may be remnants of early settlements, drowned as sea levels surged after the Ice Age. In Japan, the Yonaguni Monument, a vast series of underwater terraces and stone formations, continues to spark debate. Is it a natural formation, or evidence of human construction lost beneath the waves? Either way, the timing is suspicious, coinciding with periods of rapid sea level rise that swallowed continental shelves and coastal plains. If humanity had begun to cluster near fertile coastlines, as most cultures later would, it's not difficult to picture entire communities now resting far below the ocean. Even the archaeological record of trade suggests a level of sophistication often underestimated. Obsidian tools have been found hundreds of miles from their source, carried through exchange networks that predated farming. Seashells traveled inland, ochre pigments were swapped between groups, and stone materials were moved across large territories. These weren't isolated tribes, but interconnected communities, sharing goods, symbols, and technologies. Burials with grave goods, cave paintings, and figurines reveal shared rituals and cultural expression. If these groups were already edging toward villages, farming, and shared rituals, then the Younger Dryas wasn't just a pause, it was a reset. The genetic record adds another layer. Studies of ancient DNA suggest population bottlenecks, points in time when human numbers sharply contracted, consistent with a major stress event. Survivors rebuilt, carrying their genes into the present, but the diversity of early human groups may have been permanently reduced. This loss of genetic variety mirrors the archaeological silence left by vanished cultures. Consider also the sudden extinctions. Alongside the collapse of Clovis culture came the disappearance of mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths. Hunting may have played a role, but the scale and timing point to environmental catastrophe. For humans, these extinctions meant more than lost prey. They meant shattered ecosystems. Grasslands gave way to forests, hunting strategies failed, and lifeways had to be reinvented. In this turbulence, societies that might have become the first great civilizations never had the chance. The picture that emerges is one of promise interrupted. Cultures were experimenting with settlement, farming, and ritual. Monumental projects like Gobekli Tepe and Jericho's Tower suggest leaps of organization. Trade networks stretched across continents. Yet just as humanity seemed ready to climb to the next level, the Younger Dryas forced a retreat. Like the Clovis, some disappeared. Others fell back into mobility, like the Natufians. Still others may have preserved memories of what came before, building in stone and story, to ensure nothing was completely lost. And this leads us to a haunting possibility. If societies were already moving towards cities, monuments, and complex rituals before the Younger Dryas, then the 1,000-year storm didn't simply slow progress. It erased entire chapters. How many settlements lie drowned beneath the seas that rose 120 meters in the aftermath? How many stories of culture, innovation, and struggle vanished along with them? As we move forward, we'll turn to the stories that survived, not in ruins or artifacts, but in myths carried across generations. From Mesopotamia to the Andes, India to the Pacific, tales of great floods, sunken lands, and world-ending deluges echo the chaos of this period. Were they symbolic allegories or memories of a real catastrophe? The next step in this journey takes us from archaeology into the oldest stories humanity ever told, searching for clues to what the Younger Dryas may have left behind. Across the world, cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years of isolation tell stories of the same disaster, a great flood that nearly wiped out humanity. Whether it's carved into cuneiform tablets in Mesopotamia, whispered in Aboriginal traditions in Australia, or carried in the oral tales of Native American elders, the parallels are striking. Different names, different settings, but the same essential plot. The world drowns, only a few survive, and civilization has to start over. When we line these myths up side by side, the question becomes unavoidable. Were these just symbolic tales about renewal and destruction? Or do they echo memories of a real event, perhaps the Younger Dryas floods, that scarred human consciousness so deeply it was never forgotten? One of the most famous comes from Mesopotamia. The Epic of Gilgamesh, recorded on clay tablets thousands of years ago, preserves the tale of Utnapishtim, a man warned by the gods of a coming deluge. He builds a massive boat, loads it with his family, animals, and provisions, and survives as the waters rise and cover the land. When the flood recedes, his boat comes to rest on a mountain, and life begins again. Even older than Gilgamesh is the Atrahasis epic, which tells a nearly identical story. What's striking is how much these tales resemble the later biblical account of Noah, down to details like releasing birds to test if the land had dried. Did each culture independently invent this story? Or were they all remembering some real, traumatic event that reshaped their world? The Greeks, too, had their version. They told of Deucalion and Pyrrha, a couple chosen to survive when Zeus, angered at humanity's wickedness, sent a flood to wash away civilization. They floated in a wooden chest for 9 days and nights until the waters receded. Emerging onto dry land, they repopulated the world by casting stones over their shoulders, which transformed into men and women. Here again, we see the familiar pattern: divine warning, survival through a vessel, and the rebirth of humanity after catastrophe. If these were only moral tales, Why do they map so consistently onto physical disasters we know occurred at the end of the Ice Age? In India, flood stories also run deep. Hindu texts describe Manu, the first man, who was warned by a giant fish of an impending flood. Manu built a boat and tied it to the fish, who guided him to safety atop the Himalayas. From there, Manu repopulated the earth. This story, like the Mesopotamian and Greek accounts, features a chosen survivor, a vessel, and the saving of life from watery destruction. The flood is not just destructive. It becomes the hinge on which human history turns, a reset button for civilization itself. Considering that India's coastlines would have been dramatically redrawn during rapid post-glacial sea level rise, could these stories be distant cultural memories of shorelines vanishing beneath the waves? Further west, Native American traditions also speak of world-drowning waters. The Hopi tell of multiple worlds destroyed before the current one, with one age ending in a great flood that forced survivors to climb into the safety of a reed or be guided underground by spirit beings. The Ojibwe of the Great Lakes recount how the earth was flooded and remade by animals and humans working together, the muskrat diving deep to bring up soil so land could form again. These aren't just isolated tribal stories. They're consistent with the same catastrophic motif: water swallowing the land, humanity nearly perishing, and life restarting on new terms. Even in places far removed from ice sheets, the echoes continue. Aboriginal Australians maintain oral traditions tens of thousands of years old, some of which describe rising seas that swallowed land bridges and cut off islands from the mainland. These accounts, astonishingly, line up with geological evidence of sea level rise after the Ice Age, when coasts advanced inland by hundreds of kilometers. Entire territories that had once been hunting grounds were drowned forever. Think of the impact this would leave on communities who lived through it. Their homelands erased, their stories reshaped around survival and loss. No wonder these memories persisted in oral tradition for millennia. The sheer universality of these flood myths is difficult to ignore. Cultures separated by oceans and mountains, with no contact between them, all telling variations of the same story: divine or cosmic warning, catastrophic inundation, chosen survivors, and humanity's rebirth. Could it be coincidence? Or are they fragments of a single global memory, the Younger Dryas itself echoing down to us through story and song? Oral transmission is powerful. In societies without writing, stories become the archive, carried carefully across generations. Details shift, gods and symbols change, but the core event, a world-destroying flood, remains stubbornly the same. Some researchers argue these flood traditions encode symbolic truths rather than literal ones: the cycle of destruction and renewal, the fragility of life, or the moral failings of humans. But what if those symbolic layers were built over real events remembered by traumatized survivors? Imagine watching walls of meltwater burst from glacial lakes, seeing smoke darken the skies from continent-spanning wildfires, hearing the ground shake from collapsing ice sheets. For people who lived close to rivers and coasts, and most did, such events would not just be natural disasters. They would be the end of the world. Wouldn't you tell that story to your children? And wouldn't they tell it to theirs? And here lies the enduring mystery. If the Younger Dryas floods and upheavals were truly global, then many early settlements, especially those built along coasts, may now lie beneath the sea, lost under 100 meters of water. Is this why so many myths also speak of sunken lands and drowned cities? Plato's tale of Atlantis, though written later, follows the same flood pattern: a proud civilization swallowed by the ocean in a single day and night. Around the world, echoes of similar places exist in local lore, from Lyonesse off Cornwall to Kumari Kandam in India. Are these coincidences or scattered memories of real communities erased by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age? What's remarkable is that science and myth may be converging. The black mat layer found across North America, soot, nanodiamonds, melted materials, suggest wildfires and possible cosmic impacts during the Younger Dryas. Geological studies confirm rapid sea level rise events, sometimes meters in a single century. Archaeology shows cultures vanishing or regressing during this period, and yet myths written thousands of years later preserve memories that fit eerily well with these scientific findings. Could the stories be more than allegories? Could they be humanity's oldest historical record? If so, then perhaps we need to listen more carefully. These flood myths may not simply be tales of gods punishing mankind. They could be coded accounts of a natural catastrophe so immense that it seared itself into the collective memory of humanity. And if the world really drowned once before, what might it have taken with it? Whole civilizations, forgotten technologies, the first chapters of human history. And just as importantly, what traces did it leave behind, waiting for us to uncover in stone circles, ancient ruins, or in the stories that somehow survived long after the floodwaters retreated? When you lay all those flood traditions side by side, one after another, the question naturally becomes, what came after? If the world really did drown, then who survived, and what did they build in the aftermath? That line of thought takes us to one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of the past century, Gobekli Tepe and the wider family of Tepe sites scattered across southeastern Turkey. From a distance, Gobekli Tepe doesn't look like much. A scrubby hill, once written off as a natural mound, was left untouched for centuries, until archaeologists began digging in the 1990s. What they uncovered stunned the world. Vast stone circles crowned with T-shaped pillars, some 15 feet tall and weighing over 10 tons. These were not rough stones dragged together in haste. They were carefully quarried, carved, transported, and arranged with an intentionality that points to organization and skill far beyond what we thought possible at the time. What makes it even more startling is the age. The site dates to around 9,600 BC, right at the end of the Younger Dryas. In other words, this place rose from the ground almost immediately after the thousand-year storm subsided, when humanity should have been licking its wounds and relearning how to survive. Instead, here were people quarrying multi-ton stones and carving them with intricate images: foxes, vultures, snakes, boars, even abstract patterns whose meaning we can only guess at. Archaeologists call it the world's first temple, but that label doesn't really capture it. We can picture a circle of giant limestone slabs surrounding a central pair of towering pillars. On their surfaces are carvings so sharp they seem almost alive. Animals leaping, birds poised with wings outstretched, snakes slithering across the stone. Some of the figures are human, though strangely stylized, including headless bodies and abstract humanoid shapes. To walk into such an enclosure would have been awe-inspiring, perhaps even terrifying for the people of that era. And Gobekli Tepe wasn't alone. Across the Tastapela region, translating to Stone Hills, archaeologists have found more than a dozen similar sites. Karahan Tepe, located just 35 kilometers from Gobekli Tepe, is equally mind-bending. There, rows of phallic-shaped pillars rise from a subterranean chamber carved directly into the bedrock, while nearby T-shaped monoliths echo the design of its famous neighbor. At Sefer Tepe, Harbetsuvan Tepe, and other locations, the same themes recur: carefully arranged megaliths, sophisticated carvings, and layouts that seem to serve a ritual or symbolic purpose. Taken together, these sites suggest not an isolated anomaly, but a shared cultural explosion, a network of communities all engaging in monumental building during the earliest days of the Holocene. The question, of course, is how? The builders had no metal tools, no wheels, no domesticated beasts of burden. Conventional wisdom says they were still hunter-gatherers, people whose lives revolved around foraging, hunting, and moving with the seasons. Yet here they were, organizing hundreds of workers, planning and executing architectural feats that would challenge even later Bronze Age societies. Did they really leap forward in a single generation? Or is there another story lurking behind the stones? Some scholars argue that Gobekli Tepe and the other tepes were the crucible of civilization itself, the place where communal ritual gatherings first forced people to cooperate on a scale large enough to invent agriculture. In this view, religion or shared cosmology came first, with farming following later as a way to sustain the people drawn to these rituals. It's a reversal of the usual story, where farming supposedly led to permanent settlements and then temples. Here, it's as though the temple came before the farm. Others aren't so sure. The sudden sophistication of Gobekli Tepe has fueled speculation that its builders were not merely inventing something new, but inheriting knowledge, perhaps from survivors of an earlier culture destroyed by the younger Dryas. In this telling, Gobekli Tepe becomes less of a beginning and more of a rebirth, the first attempt to rebuild civilization after the flood. The carvings themselves deepen the intrigue. One pillar, nicknamed the Vulture Stone, has been interpreted by some researchers as a kind of star map, with animals representing constellations. According to this theory, the stone encodes the memory of a comet strike around 10,900 BC, the very event proposed by some as the trigger for the younger Dryas. While many mainstream archaeologists remain skeptical of such readings, the possibility that these stones encode astronomical knowledge has kept the debate alive. Were these just symbolic animals, or were they something more? An ancient record carved in stone to preserve the memory of a world-shattering event. Even the treatment of the site raises questions. Around 8000 BC, after centuries of use, Gobekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Its enclosures were carefully backfilled with rubble, preserving them in astonishing condition for millennia. Why would people go to such lengths to bury their own masterpiece? Was it simply a ritual closure, a cultural decision to move on? Or did they intend it as a message for the future, a time capsule of sorts, waiting to be uncovered long after they were gone? The debate between mainstream archaeologists and alternative theorists only adds to the site's mystique. To most academics, Gobekli Tepe proves that humans were capable of far more in the pre-agricultural world than previously assumed. To others, it is evidence of a forgotten chapter in human history, an echo of an advanced society wiped out by the floods, preserved only in scattered myths and these mysterious stone circles. Both sides agree on one thing: the site has rewritten the story of human beginnings. And it's not just Gobekli Tepe. Karahan Tepe's subterranean chambers, with their eerily phallic pillars, suggest rituals whose meaning we can only guess at. Tastepeler's multiple enclosures imply a network of sacred sites, possibly connected by shared beliefs or seasonal migrations. The broader picture is one of startling complexity, a cultural landscape that forces us to reconsider what human communities were capable of 12,000 years ago. When you step back and look at the timing, the symbolism, and the sheer ambition of these projects, one question keeps resurfacing. Were these monuments humanity's first attempt to rebuild civilization after the flood? If the younger Dryas was indeed the Great Flood remembered in myths across the world, then Gobekli Tepe and its sister sites may represent the survivors' response, an effort to carve memory, ritual, and perhaps warning into stone. As we continue this journey, we'll see how other ancient traditions, from myths of gods and giants to stories of forgotten golden ages, intersect with these mysterious stone circles. But whether you see Gobekli Tepe as the birthplace of religion, the cradle of agriculture, or the last echo of a lost world, one thing is certain: it marks a threshold. Beyond it, history begins to look less like a steady march from primitive to advanced, and more like a story with missing chapters, erased by flood and fire, and whispered back to us through stone. Leaving behind the mysterious stone circles of Turkey, our trail of clues leads us further southwest, into the deserts of Egypt, where one of the most recognizable monuments in the world stands silently staring across the sands. The Great Sphinx of Giza is instantly familiar, a lion's body with a human head carved from bedrock, guarding the pyramids. But beneath its iconic form lies a debate that cuts to the heart of the Younger Dryas story, because some researchers believe the Sphinx itself may preserve the scars of the Great Flood. Conventional Egyptology tells us the Sphinx was built around 2500 BC during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre. In this view, it's a dynastic monument, part of the pyramid complex, carved to reflect royal power and divine authority. But in the early 1990s, geologist Robert Schoch and independent researcher John Anthony West shook this narrative. They pointed out that the Sphinx enclosure, the wall surrounding the monument, shows signs of deep, rounded weathering, more consistent with rainfall erosion than with wind and sand. Yet here's the problem. Egypt hasn't seen sustained heavy rainfall since long before dynastic times. The last period when torrents of rain fell across the region was at the end of the Ice Age, roughly 10,000 years ago, right at the close of the Younger Dryas. This led Schoch and West to argue that the Sphinx, or at least its core body, may be far older than mainstream archaeology admits. Instead of being a Bronze Age creation, it could date back to around 7,000 to 9,000 BC, or even earlier, surviving from a time when Egypt's climate was radically different. The suggestion was explosive. If true, it would mean Egypt inherited the Sphinx from a forgotten culture, one that may have endured the chaos of the Younger Dryas and left behind this enduring monument as proof of their existence. Critics counter that the erosion patterns could be explained by other factors, such as subsurface water or unique weathering conditions. They also point to the stylistic links between the Sphinx and known Old Kingdom art. But the argument won't go away. Even some geologists unaffiliated with Schoch have admitted that the weathering looks distinctly like water damage, far beyond what desert winds could cause. And when you pair this with the curious fact that the Sphinx has no clear inscriptions tying it definitively to Khafre, the cracks in the orthodox timeline start to widen. Adding to the intrigue are Egypt's own flood traditions. The Nile, the lifeblood of the region, has always been tied to cycles of inundation, fertility, and destruction. Ancient Egyptian texts refer to the Tepe, the first time, a mythical golden age when gods ruled the land before kingship passed to humans. Some interpret this as a symbolic prehistory, but others wonder if it encodes memories of a lost, pre-dynastic civilization destroyed by floodwaters. The imagery of the Nile swelling beyond its banks, reshaping the land, may echo far older experiences, possibly even those of the Younger Dryas deluges. If the Sphinx really does predate dynastic Egypt, its builders would have seen a different Giza, lush, storm-lashed, and far wetter than the desert we know today. Communities of survivors, perhaps remnants of an earlier culture, carved the Sphinx as part of a sacred site. Its lion's body symbolizing strength, its human face a memory of rulers or culture bringers long forgotten. Later dynasties may have inherited it, restoring the head, reshaping details, and weaving it into their own narratives, while the original builders faded into myth. The mystery deepens when you look at the Sphinx in relation to the pyramids. If the Sphinx is truly older, it suggests that the Giza Plateau was already considered sacred long before Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure raised their great tombs. Could it be that the pyramids themselves were an attempt to align with or emulate an even older sacred tradition rooted in memories of cataclysm? Whether one accepts the orthodox view or the radical hypothesis, the Sphinx remains a puzzle. Its silent face has weathered millennia of storms, sands, and speculation, yet it refuses to reveal its origins. Was it really carved in the age of pharaohs? Or is it a relic from the end of the Ice Age, scarred by rains from a world that no longer exists? If the latter, then Egypt's greatest symbol might also be one of humanity's oldest, a literal monument to survival in the wake of global catastrophe. And here lies the haunting question. If the Sphinx does indeed carry the scars of the Great Flood, then what else might lie beneath Egypt's sands, structures, records, or entire chapters of history swept away when the younger Dryas reshaped the earth? Moving further away into the distant lands of South America, we encounter ruins that defy both explanation and conventional timelines. At Tiwanaku in Bolivia, high on the windswept Altiplano near Lake Titicaca, colossal blocks of andesite and sandstone are fitted together with precision so fine that even a razor blade can barely slide between them. Some stones weigh more than 100 tons, hauled from quarries miles away across rugged terrain. The site's Akapana Pyramid, Kalasasaya Temple, and the enigmatic Gateway of the Sun suggest a society with advanced astronomical knowledge and engineering prowess. Yet mainstream archaeology places Tiwanaku around 500 AD, relatively recent in the grand scheme. But alternative views propose something different, that some of these foundations predate the Andean civilizations we know, perhaps reaching back to the aftermath of the younger Dryas. Could Tiwanaku's oldest stones be remnants of a much earlier culture, whose memory survived through myth until later peoples rebuilt upon them? Not far away, the walls of Sacsayhuaman loom above the Peruvian city of Cusco. These cyclopean fortifications are made of massive limestone blocks, some over 300 tons, locked together like a jigsaw puzzle with no mortar. Their curved and angled shapes interlock in ways that make the walls almost earthquake-proof, a feature modern engineers still admire. Mainstream historians attribute them to the Incas, but even they admitted the walls were inherited, built on foundations whose origins remain unknown. The Incas themselves claim to have inherited much of their infrastructure from earlier peoples. If that's true, were they simply the caretakers of a legacy reaching back into the deep past, perhaps even to a time when floods and upheaval forced survivors to rebuild at high altitudes, far from the vulnerable coasts? Shifting the map eastward, we reach Southeast Asia and the submerged continent known as Sundaland. During the Ice Age, vast stretches of land connected modern-day Malaysia, Indonesia, and surrounding islands into a broad, habitable plain. As sea levels rose at the end of the Younger Dryas, much of this landscape vanished beneath the waves. Today, all that remains are scattered islands. But ancient legends from the region recall a drowned homeland, echoing flood myths elsewhere. Could Sundaland have hosted complex societies whose traces now lie beneath 100 meters of ocean? The possibility lingers, especially when we consider submerged ruins like those near Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan. There, divers discovered what appears to be a stepped pyramid, terraces, and pathways carved into stone beneath the waves. Some argue it is natural formation, shaped by tectonics and erosion. Others insist the sharp angles, stair-like platforms, and possible carvings suggest human modification, perhaps a sunken city swallowed when Ice Age seas surged. Closer to Europe, we find Doggerland, the lost landscape beneath the North Sea. Once, this was a lush plain connecting Britain to mainland Europe, teeming with animals and dotted with human settlements. Rising seas gradually drowned it between 6,500 and 6,000 BC, forcing Mesolithic communities to higher ground. Fishermen still haul up bones of mammoths, aurochs, and ancient tools from its depths. Consider the trauma of watching your homeland vanish as the sea swallowed forests, rivers, and villages. Oral traditions may well have carried those memories forward, transforming them into myths of great floods that erased the world. And then there is the Black Sea deluge theory. Around 5,600 BC, rising Mediterranean waters are thought to have broken through the Bosporus, flooding into the Black Sea basin and raising its level dramatically. Some geologists suggest this event inspired the biblical flood story and other regional myths. Archaeological evidence of ancient shorelines and drowned settlements adds weight to the idea. For the people living there, the flood would have been catastrophic. Familiar farmlands consumed, coastlines redrawn overnight. Whether local or global in memory, it is the kind of event that survives in story long after written records fade. What ties all these places together, Tiwanaku, Sacsayhuaman, Sundaland, Yonaguni, Doggerland, the Black Sea, is the haunting possibility that the Younger Dryas and its aftermath did more than change climates. It may have erased entire chapters of human history, sweeping away coastal settlements and forcing survivors to rebuild in new landscapes. If early civilizations clustered along fertile coasts and river valleys, how many are now lost beneath the waves, invisible to us except in scattered myths and puzzling ruins? So we are left with the tantalizing question: if so many coastlines were swallowed by the sea, how many civilizations, advanced, experimental, or even proto-urban, lie hidden under the ocean, waiting to be rediscovered? And if even fragments of them surface, will they rewrite the story of when humanity truly began to build? Throughout world mythology, there's a strange, recurring figure that appears in culture after culture: the teacher who arrives in the aftermath of disaster. These are not gods in the traditional sense, but beings described as wise, skilled, and distinctly different from ordinary humans, often emerging after a flood or catastrophe to guide shattered communities back toward order. The stories are so consistent across continents that they invite a deeper question: are these just archetypal tales of renewal, or faint echoes of real survivors carrying knowledge from a forgotten world? Take Mesopotamia, for example. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, a pantheon of powerful beings who were said to have ruled the earth in an age before kingship was handed down to humans. In their texts, the flood separates these primordial rulers from the mortal dynasties that follow. Were the Anunnaki purely symbolic, representations of natural forces and social order, or were they memories of a vanished pre-flood people? Some see pure myth. Others note the precise lists of rulers and reigns, wondering if they're fragments of distant history disguised as legend. A similar thread winds its way through Mesoamerican traditions. Among the Aztecs, Quetzalcoatl is portrayed as a feathered serpent deity, but also as a culture bringer, teaching people how to farm, create laws, and build. Legends tell of him appearing after cycles of destruction, including a great flood, guiding humanity back to civilization. The Maya had Kukulkan, nearly identical in role and symbolism. Were these deities inventions of imagination, or were they mythologized versions of leaders who carried lost knowledge across the threshold of catastrophe? In the Andes, the figure of Viracocha looms large. He was said to have emerged from Lake Titicaca after a great deluge, walking the land and teaching survivors architecture, agriculture, and moral codes before vanishing across the sea. Spanish chroniclers recorded how local traditions insisted Viracocha was not a god in the abstract sense, but a tall, human-like figure whose presence sparked awe. The parallels with Oannes in Mesopotamia, a fishman who rose from the Persian Gulf to teach writing, farming, and city building, are uncanny. Two cultures, oceans apart, both remembering a teacher emerging from the water to restore what had been lost. Even in North America, traditions preserve echoes of similar figures. Among the Hopi, the ant people sheltered humanity underground during cataclysms, teaching them how to survive until the world was safe again. Across the Great Plains, stories recall giants and culture heroes who lived before a great flood, some destroyed, and others passing on knowledge to those who came after. If these were purely symbolic, why do they align so closely with stories from the old world? The pattern becomes even clearer when we consider India. In Hindu texts, after the flood that nearly drowned the world, Manu is saved by a great fish and instructed in how to restart society. But in later traditions, sages and rishis are described as emerging in the new age with preserved wisdom from earlier times, seeding the foundations of civilization again. What's fascinating is that these figures almost always appear after destruction, not before. They don't start civilizations from scratch, but rather act as restorers, rebuilding from memory. This opens an intriguing possibility. Were these culture bringers survivors of pre-Younger Dryas societies, carrying fragments of architecture, astronomy, and farming knowledge into the New Age? If so, the myths may not be mere metaphors, but storytelling vessels preserving the memory of real people who looked like gods to the traumatized survivors they encountered. Archaeological evidence hints at cultural continuities that lend weight to the idea. Consider Gobekli Tepe's sudden emergence with advanced iconography, or the Sumerian king list that speaks of rulers reigning before the flood. Add to that the unexplained precision of megalithic walls in South America, or the rapid spread of agricultural knowledge after 9,600 BC. These are moments where history feels less like a gradual climb and more like a reboot, as though someone hit reset but left behind traces of an older, greater program. So what are we to make of the Anunnaki, Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, Oannes, and the countless others? Are they myths woven from human imagination, universal responses to trauma and rebirth? Or are they faint but persistent memories of flesh and blood teachers, survivors of the Younger Dryas catastrophe who carried forward fragments of a world that drowned? Because if the world really did collapse around 12,800 years ago, then humanity may not have had just one beginning. We may have had several, each reset punctuated by disaster, with the survivors elevated into legend. And perhaps, when ancient scribes and storytellers spoke of gods walking among men, they were really whispering about the ones who remembered. As the myths and archaeological clues leave us with tantalizing questions, the debate really sharpens when we turn to the people who've tried to stitch the pieces together into a coherent theory. Some argue that the Younger Dryas wasn't just a climate hiccup. It was the cataclysm that wiped out a whole chapter of human history. Others push back, warning that we risk confusing speculation with evidence. Either way, the clash of ideas is part of what makes this story so gripping. One of the most visible voices is Graham Hancock, whose book, Magicians of the Gods, took the case for a lost civilization to a global audience. Hancock argues that the Younger Dryas flood buried a culture more advanced than any we've acknowledged, a society of magicians who carried fragments of knowledge across the catastrophe and helped kickstart civilization anew. For him, sites like Gobekli Tepe aren't anomalies. They're fingerprints of this forgotten chapter, survivors leaving stone records where oral memory might fail. His critics accuse him of cherry-picking and leaning too heavily on myth, but Hancock's skill lies in taking disparate puzzles, sunken ruins, flood stories, unexplained monuments, and presenting them as a single haunting picture. What if we've lost more than we realize? Alongside him, though less of a household name, is Randall Carlson. A geologist with a taste for the catastrophic, Carlson points to landscapes like the scablands of Washington state, shaped by sudden, massive floods. These were once dismissed as impossible, until mainstream geology conceded that the Missoula floods at the end of the Ice Age carved those canyons in days, not millennia. Carlson argues the Younger Dryas saw something on a far grander scale, glacial lakes rupturing, torrents sweeping across continents, fire and flood working in tandem. His point is simple but unsettling. If cataclysm could reshape North America once, what's to say it didn't erase human settlements along the way? Then there's Robert Schoch, who turned attention back to Egypt with his water erosion hypothesis. Looking at the Sphinx, Schoch noted deep weathering patterns that, he argues, could only have been carved by prolonged rainfall Egypt hasn't seen since the end of the Ice Age. That would push the Sphinx's construction thousands of years earlier than the dynasties of pharaohs, maybe even into the shadow of the Younger Dryas. Mainstream Egyptology bristles at this claim, but the idea lingers. Could the world's most iconic monument be a survivor of an earlier flood-swept era? On the other side stand the mainstream academics who acknowledge the evidence of abrupt change but stop short of linking it to a lost civilization. They acknowledge the black mat layer found across continents, a band of soot, carbon, and nanodiamonds that marks a violent shift around 12,800 years ago. They recognize the abrupt collapse of the Clovis culture, the extinctions, the strange synchronicity of disasters. What they resist is the leap from catastrophe to ancient civilizations, a caution rooted in the need for evidence, not story. They argue that while floods, fires, and climate swings are undeniable, turning them into proof of a lost global civilization goes further than the facts allow. And here lies the tension. Is the pushback against figures like Hancock, Carlson, and Schoch about protecting academic rigor or protecting the timeline itself? After all, if monuments like Gobekli Tepe or the Sphinx are older than we think, if the flood myths carry kernels of truth, then the linear story of progress, primitive to advanced, step by step, unravels. It would mean civilization has risen and fallen more than once, and our version is only the latest. So we're left with a debate that's as much about philosophy as evidence. Do we accept the record at face value, cautious of straying beyond what can be proved? Or do we follow the smoke and wonder if it hints at fire, that maybe, just maybe, the world drowned once before, and we've only just begun to remember what it took with it? So as we look back on this journey, it's hard not to sympathize with the raw terror and awe of living through the Younger Dryas. One day the world seemed stable, rivers flowing, animals migrating, people gathering and thriving. And the next, everything was chaos. Walls of water tore through valleys, coastlines slipped beneath the sea, and fires raged across skies blackened with smoke. Entire cultures scrambled to survive, clinging to high ground or fleeing inland, leaving behind little more than scattered artifacts and the whispers of their stories. And maybe that's the most haunting part. The silence that followed. The missing layers in archaeology. The myths that echo with warnings. The ruins that seem older than they should be. We've traced those threads together, from flood legends in Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica, to mysterious stone circles in Turkey, to the battered face of the Sphinx, and to theorists daring to suggest that history's first chapter is missing. The patterns don't give us every answer, but they do suggest our past may hold missing chapters we've barely begun to recover. It's staggering to think about how many of humanity's earliest attempts at civilization might still be hidden. Entire coastlines are now 100 meters beneath the ocean. Whole landscapes, Doggerland in Europe, Sundaland in Asia, even drowned river valleys in the Americas, are waiting to be explored. If a flood truly reshaped the world 12,000 years ago, how many cities, temples, or entire cultures were lost to the waves? And yet, survivors endured. They rebuilt, they remembered, and they passed down warnings in the only way they could, through story. Those stories still resonate across continents and millennia, carrying with them glimpses of an age erased but not entirely forgotten. Whether you see them as myths, metaphors, or encoded memories, they remain some of our oldest inheritances, so the mystery remains open. Was the Younger Dryas simply nature at its most chaotic, or the true origin of humanity's great flood memory? Did it erase civilizations we have yet to rediscover? Or was it the turning point that forced humanity to start over, building the foundations of the world we know today? That's where I'll leave it to you. What do you think? Was the Great Flood of legend a real event tied to the Younger Dryas? Or just coincidence that so many cultures remembered water as the destroyer? Let us know your theories in the comments, because these are the mysteries best explored together. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most dramatic chapters in human history, make sure to subscribe for more explorations into lost civilizations, unexplained ruins, and the secrets still hidden in our past. As always, until next time, stay curious.